Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Like and share this video, join the Rabyd Nation, a nation of people dedicated to normalizing atheism and deconversion by hitting that subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button and your membership options that lead to citizenship in the Rabyd Nation will be presented to you. Today I am responding to Sean McDowell and his son Scotty as they respond to an atheist 10 commandments. The problem is, as Skeptics and Scoundrels with Paulogia point out in their video dealing with this same video, is that Sean is getting the whole commandment thing wrong, as these are actually the results of a survey conducted by the authors of the book, Atheist Mind, Humanist Heart. Skeptics and Scoundrels / Paulogia do a good job in showing how this is a problem, so I will link their video in the description. I will say I also think this is why the title of the video was changed from Apologist versus Atheist 10 Non-Commandments. Basically what happened is Sean changed the title of the video but didn't redo the footage, and so he continues to assert during the video that these are atheist commandments, even though he recognizes that he was probably wrong on that. Come on, Sean, do a little homework. But also, why would atheists have commandments in the first place, as it seems to be a religious thing where people think that they take their morality from a divine dictate? It's kind of antithetical to being an atheist to think that morality is based on divine dictate. You should have been suspicious of the word commandment being used and associated with atheists in the first place. My interest, of course, is to give my own rabid atheist spin on this, my own thoughts on it. And I'm responding to Sean as a former pastor, theologian, and Christian. So without further ado.
How might a Christian professor respond to the top 10 new atheist commandments? This came from a CNN website article, and it was entitled, "Behold, Atheists' New 10 Commandments." I'm here with my son, Scotty, who's gonna ask me for my thoughts and my reactions. You ready to go, buddy?
Let's do this thing.
So how would a Christian professor respond to 10 atheist commandments? It is an intriguing idea, as the idea of atheist commandments, or in this case, non-commandments, are usually a response to the 10 commandments of the Bible, which, by the way, are a jumbled mess with two different variants depending on whether you're in Exodus or Deuteronomy. So when atheists do 10 commandments list, they're usually responding with something they believe is better and more up-to-date and, quite frankly, changeable. But let's see what they are and how you respond to them.
Atheist commandment number 1.
Be open-minded and be willing to alter your beliefs with new evidence.
I actually love that it starts here because this is an area that Christians and atheists can find some common ground. I think it's built into the scriptures that we should follow evidence, that we should believe what is true and reject what is false. So there's some Christians who are open-minded, willing to alter their beliefs, and there's some that are not. There's some atheists who are open-minded and willing to follow their beliefs, and some who are not. But bottom line, commandment number 1, love it. That's good common ground across worldviews.
Be open-minded and be willing to alter your beliefs with new evidence. Can a Christian really do this on certain issues? I don't think you can. I mean, if new evidence came forward that proved Jesus didn't rise from the dead, could you change your belief and presuppositions about God because of it? I mean, it would completely alter your life, particularly for those of you in the ministry. What would that do? All of a sudden, your livelihood, everything, that revolves around Christianity would be destroyed. You really can't be open-minded as much as you think about that and remain a Christian. Your mind would remain closed to it, and you would question it, and you would continue to fight it, even if evidence came forward that Jesus Christ didn't rise from the dead. I, however, can remain open to new evidence for God, although I don't hold out a lot of hope given the current state of apologetics. But there are some things the Bible says are true that you say the Bible says so you can't be open-minded about those things. I would also ask where in the Bible it says that I should follow evidence. I seem to remember a lot about following in faith, which I get you think is evidence, but from the atheist perspective it is not. Faith is really believing in something for which you have no evidence. It's auto-deceptive from my perspective. And so you can't bring forth faith evidence because I don't consider that evidence. So where in the world does the Bible, in its content, say to be open-minded and to consider evidence? If anything, it says, have faith in God regardless of what the evidence says. So I don't really know where you're getting this idea that there's some common ground here. I don't think there's as much as you think there is.
Atheist commandment number 2.
Strive to understand what is most likely to be true, not to believe what you wish to be true.
Okay, again, I love it. And this is a human issue for every worldview. We're all tempted to want to believe the things that fit our narrative, that we want to be true, reject things that are inconvenient. Again, these first two, I agree. I would say amen to my atheist friends. But embedded in this is that we ought to follow truth for its own sake. I don't know where that obligation comes from within an atheist worldview. Now, in a Christian worldview, there's a God who's designed us to build a certain way. He's given us reliable faculties that we ought to follow. In an atheist worldview, we have bubbled up through a purposeless material evolutionary process. And truth helps us instrumentally navigate the world. But I'm not sure you can make the argument within an atheist worldview that truth in itself is objectively good and we ought to follow it.
Strive to understand what is most likely to be true, not to believe what you wish to be true. It doesn't even really give that idea that this is the desire to follow it as an objective truth. It is worded with the phrase most likely to indicate this evaluative mind. I think you're injecting the idea that commandment is saying that the atheist worldview, in the atheist worldview, that truth is an objective good. Although I would say it gets humorous to think of anything else that could fit into that role. Truth to me has the value of improving life and leading to human prosperity. So why wouldn't I put it high on the list of things to follow for my overall benefit as well as the benefit of others? There does not need to be an overall objective purpose for it to have meaning, practical and pragmatic meaning in the now. I also want to point out at this point that Sean uses the word objectively throughout this video, and I'm going to say I don't think it means what he thinks it means. The fact in his truth is subjected to the revelation of God, he says grants it. This is not objective in his worldview either, but he claims it is. It is completely subject to God and thus subjective. It's kind of an annoying thing that Christians continue to do.
Atheist commandment number 3.
The scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world.
The claim is the scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world. That is a claim that's not a scientific claim. You cannot test that claim through the scientific method. This very commandment concedes that there's other very important and valuable non-scientific ways of understanding the world. Now, there's big common ground here in the value of science between atheists and between Christians. There's no coincidence that the greatest scientific pioneers, whether it's Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Pasteur, Galileo, were theists. Most Christians. We agree that science is a powerful way of understanding the natural world. But within this worldview, the natural world is all that exists. And of course, I believe there's other kinds of knowledge and things beyond the physical natural world that are real. And I would argue like moral faculties. I know as much as I know anything in the world that it's wrong to torture a child for fun. I know that as clearly as I do any scientific statement.
The scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world. Your response has a couple of problems. Actually, this is a scientific claim that could be tested if you put it in the right way of framing it. I mean, give people a question to solve and have 10 scientists go into a room, 10 philosophers, and 10 Christians that are going to pray about it. And after a lot of time, see which comes up with better fact-supported answers that have actual predictive results. I'm going to bet on science having the best reliable results. The philosophers may have some ideas if they're really thinking about it, and the Christians will have some sort of revelation of God that probably won't have predictable results and will probably be dead wrong once tested. And that's the problem. Two, yeah, there are other ways of understanding the natural world, but I find the scientific method to be the best way. Okay, so what? The non-commandment isn't about exclusivity, but recognizing the best. This commandment doesn't say it's the only way of understanding the natural world. It says it's the best way, and you seem to miss that. You then go into all these scientists that had faith, and I say, so what? You do say most, not all, so you do save yourself there a little bit because I'm fairly certain that Einstein and several others were not believers. But what causal connection do you have between their belief and their discoveries? They discovered these things often in the face of what the church told them to believe. I think Galileo, for instance, is a great example of a scientist who discovered something that the church told him he wasn't allowed to say. Okay, so the idea that religion or their religion or belief helped them in these discoveries can be demonstrably proven to be false or have no bearing whatsoever. Whether they believe in God or not had no bearing. You can have different people repeat their experiments and get the same results, regardless of what their belief in God is. Another thing is, you believe that these things are beyond the natural world. You keep saying that you believe in stuff beyond it, but you have, nor has anyone ever believed or ever demonstrated them. In short, what you accept as assertions with no evidence and take them as truth. As an atheist, I just find that unconvincing. It's interesting that you bring up a moral quandary at the end, because I can get the same conclusion subjectively. Torturing, killing children for fun, because it does not line up with subjective goals, is also have objective rules. One can have the objective understanding this is wrong without a God. It is interesting that you bring up morality as something not scientifically verified, when science has been doing work on morality from an evolutionary view for a long time, including there's this evolutionary natural moral ideas that have begun to surface out of evolutionary thinking of why morality exists, and it's simply inherently part of a social species. But also, biblical morality is that if God says it's okay, even killing and torturing children for fun. And we actually have some examples in the Bible where children are being killed by God in genocides and his people, including even within his own people, including child sacrifice to keep a vow. It is your morality that's based on the subject of God. That means you can think it's okay to kill and torture a child if God commands it. I've even heard apologists say this. I can see where it is with subjective goals of morality, such as a good life and prosperity, we can create the objective rule that killing and torturing children is always wrong. You can't do that. You have an out clause in saying if God says it's okay, then it's okay.
Atheist commandment number 4.
Every person has the right to control of their body.
Okay, now, as Christians, I would agree that we have bodily autonomy, but I think we all recognize that our right to our own body is limited when we're going to harm another human being. So I can drive my car where I want to, but I cannot drive it on the sidewalk, legally or morally, because I very much might harm somebody else. I don't have the moral right to go naked and go running through the middle of where we live, because people would say you're harming me even if I don't physically touch them. I do find it interesting that some of the main people who made this argument, and this was pre-COVID, will turn around and say you have the right to bodily autonomy, but you have to wear a mask. Now, I'm not making a point whether you should wear a mask or not make a mask, but to say that somebody else should wear a mask because you might harm somebody else with your body is to concede that there's limitations on bodily autonomy. So obviously this is being applied to abortion. I'd say a woman has the right to do whatever she wants to with her own body if the unborn is not human. And the science is very clear that it is.
Every person has the right to control of their body. I also think, like many others, the analogy that you give here is a bad one. I would drive on the sidewalk if someone's life is at stake. I also think you picked a bad example in the mask. I think vaccination would have been better, because then the issue of bodily autonomy is more in focus. Because then you're actually getting a procedure done to yourself. I found myself as a libertarian in the position, and being an atheist and a believer in science, that I know vaccines are beneficial. But I don't think the state has the right to mandate them based on bodily autonomy. Of course, there are limitations to any of these things because they're not commandments. This is a non-commandment, doesn't state there are not. It simply says that each person has the right to decide through bodily autonomy what happens to their own personal body. There's other rules that I think would begin to apply when dealing with the others. The abortion thing I think I will leave because the science is actually subject to what people think constitutes a living human being. You say the science proves that it is a living being, but that's a debatable point as to where life begins. The debate is always at the point, when does a fetus become a human? I know that this doesn't really actually fit any atheist set position, because I have found atheists all over the spectrum on this issue. But I do think bodily autonomy is a good starting point. And I don't think that this so-called commandment, which is really a non-commandment, actually states that this is the only thing that's done in morality.
Atheist commandment number 5.
God is not necessary to be a good person or to live a full and meaningful life.
Okay, so it depends on what's meant by God is not necessary. It's not necessary to believe in God. Even as a Christian, I would say, atheists can and often are moral. As a Christian, I'd say, because they're made in God's image and still live in God's world. The real question is, can you have the idea of being a good person and living an objectively meaningful life if there is no God? So if you think about a book, somebody could read a book if they don't believe in authors. But can you have books without authors? The answer is no. So if there's such a thing as what it objectively means to be a good person and what it objectively means to live a meaningful life, I'm not sure how you get there without an objective standard of meaning, an objective standard of good that points towards a God. So I agree with the atheist, you don't have to believe in God to do so. I just don't think you can get objective morality or an objectively meaningful life if there is no God.
God is not necessary to be a good person or to live a full and meaningful life. So your reason as a theist is the unproven assertion that we are made in God's image and live in his world, and absent of any evidence for it. This continues to be your problem. What it objectively means to be a good person, that assumes objective morality even exists, which even in belief of God, that would make it subjective to what God says is moral. In order to have an objective morality, such moral standards would have to exist outside any mind. We would have to answer the dilemma that God says something is moral because it is objectively moral regardless of God's opinion on it. But then you would be proving the objective morality, but God is then not necessary for it. And so the first premise of the moral argument falls because in order to have objective morality, we'd have to prove that God is not necessary for it to exist. The moment you say because it says it's moral, then it's subjective to God. Sean, you're constantly demonstrating a thing I find annoying these days about apologists, slapping that word objective around regarding morality as if you have even proven objective morality exists. If you actually did prove objective morality exists, you would actually prove that God isn't necessary for it. So you're kind of in a quandary there.
Atheist commandment number 6.
Be mindful of the consequences of all your actions and recognize that you must take responsibility for them.
Okay, in some ways, this is great. This is a human principle. I totally agree. But what this does is we often hear people say things like, hey, to each his own, you do whatever you want to do. But then what does this say? Be mindful of the consequences of your actions and take responsibility for them. So in some ways, this is contradicting an earlier principle. It says, I have, authority over my own body. But now they're saying, oh, actually, you are supposed to make certain actions because you have responsibility how it affects others. So I agree with the principle. I think there's just a little bit of tension built into these top 10 atheist commandments.
Be mindful of the consequences of all your actions and recognize that you must take responsibility for it. It is not a contradiction to respect everyone's bodily autonomy and this non-commandment at the same time. The idea is one is actually very libertarian in respecting everybody's freedoms without violating other people's freedoms. There is a tension in every moral system, and I expect one to be created by online surveying like this one would have them. But I don't think the tension is as great as you make it out to be. Taking responsibility on how my actions affect others doesn't mean I have to give up my own bodily autonomy or my own freedoms.
Atheist commandment number 7.
Treat others as you would want them to treat you and can reasonably expect them to want to be treated.
So in some ways, this is the golden rule, which is not unique to Christianity. You see it in Judaism. C.S. Lewis has documented in other cultures throughout the history of the world. In fact, you see it in Buddhism and even in Scientology. Well, I think where I would maybe push back is it says, treat them as you can reasonably expect them to want to be treated. I'm not exactly sure what's meant by reasonably. Bottom line, a Christian view of love is that I am to be committed to your objective best. That's what it means to be loving. Now, sometimes people might resist that. We are to do what's objectively loving for them. So I think there's a lot of common ground. I just would want this fleshed out a little bit more.
Treat others as you want them to treat you and can reasonably expect them to want to be treated. Think about the perspective. The thing about this, and the reason why there's an addition to this, is it gets through the loophole that the standard golden rule has. I think this is one of this desire where I've heard about it from both Skeptics and Scoundrels and Paulogia's video and other places, of the desire to move from beyond the golden rule to a platinum rule. The problem is the subjective nature of treat people like you want to be treated. Some people don't want to be treated the same way as others, and some people don't want as much help as others. And this edition is simply taking that subjectivity into account. In other words, think about their perspective, which is a part of the thing you didn't deal with. But the perspective of the person is very interesting. Getting to know their perspective and then discovering how you want to treat them is part of the issue. Don't just assume that you know what they want, is basically the idea here. Once again, the word objectively. I don't have an objective best for what is best for me. What is best for me is subject to the moment that I am living. I see the assertions of objective best and objective love with no proof that they actually exist. Love is constantly subjective, and so is what is best for me is constantly subjective. It's constantly changing, and how love is expressed is constantly changing, and what it means to people is constantly changing. This makes it very subject to the individual. Lastly, I don't expect a list of non-commandments to be fleshed out when they're created by a survey.
Atheist commandment number 8.
We have the responsibility to consider others, including future generations.
I love it. I totally agree that we have a responsibility to consider others, including future generations. I just don't know where that responsibility and that moral obligation comes from if there's not a God. So I agree with the atheist. Many atheists do this, and I commend them for it. And a lot of Christians don't. But I want to know where that duty to have responsibility to our posterity comes from. If there's not a God, I don't see it.
We have the responsibility to consider others, including future generations. So what you're basically saying is without God, you don't see how wanting things to be better for humans in the future is reasonable. Why not? I mean, you're basically saying to your own son across the table, without God, I don't see why I should want a better world for you to live in. Deal with it, kid. I would say that the subjective desire for my progeny to have a better life than myself is enough for me. And it's enough for me to want something better for them. I want to live and flourish in this world, and I want them to live in this world better than I, because that allows my progeny to have more success in the future. I guess my human empathy hasn't been crushed by the need for God to be involved. The subjective good for myself and my fellow human beings going forward is enough for me.
Atheist commandment number 9.
There's no one right way to live.
Now, it depends on what you mean, no one right way. Even in the Bible, it talks about not judging certain people because people have different kinds of liberty when it comes to choices that they make. There's also differences in spiritual gifts that people might have. So we're unique, we have different professions, but I do find it somewhat in tension with the other ones that are telling us certain ways that we should live and says there's no one right way to live. Clearly, atheists think that the atheist worldview is correct, and we ought to conform our lives to it, including this list.
There's no one right way to live. Boy, this is where Sean not doing his homework really hurt him in his response. These aren't commandments, okay? They really aren't, okay? What they are is more like guidelines than actual rules. So his assessment is flawed all the way through. No one is being told how to live with this. What this is really about is understanding that each person faces life differently, that they all go in different directions. You know, there's a difference in different issues for each person, that each person is going to have to discover their own way to live is something that he doesn't really seem to get. Of course, Sean doesn't want to mention that this flies in the face of Christian exclusivism, where Jesus reportedly says he is the personification of the way, the truth, and the life, where no one comes to the Father but through him, where there is salvation in no other, etc., etc. Let's be honest, this flies in the face of any exclusive you must live this way, and Christianity is definitely one of those systems that does this.
Atheist commandment number 10.
Leave the world a better place than when you found it.
Love it, I agree, and I know many atheists personally who are doing this. In fact, I know many who are doing it better than Christians are doing it. But built into this is that we have a duty, an obligation, a commandment to actually do so. And this implies that there's better ways to live, hence leave the world a better place and less better places. But if there's no God, and there's no design, and there's no purpose, I don't know objectively what better is where I have a duty to do so. That's where I think it kind of falls short.
Leave the world a better place than when you found it. You really have trouble accepting the idea that better is a subjectively based idea altogether, don't you? What is better for me and better for you in one society and another society has no objective basis. what's better for them is going to be subjected to the moment and where they're at. There is no objective better. And this actually, the idea is subject to the people who act on the idea. That's why it's not a commandment, it's a guideline. That's okay. I too have trouble with this because I understand that everybody's fighting for what is better. And this is kind of where some of the conflict and things come into life. What is better is actually a legitimate question. But I don't think bringing God into it makes it better. Or does the God of the Bible even have the aim of making the world better? Rather, he seems to be holding out until he destroys it in the end to make a new one. I actually don't know how you can actually agree to this non-commandment, as your God basically has promised that this world will pass away and a new one will be created in its place. Under your view of God, you don't actually have a motive to make it better, just to wait for its inevitable end. You would actually expect it to get worse. I, on the other hand, have a duty to this world because it is essential to my survival and well-being. I don't believe we're going to get an alternative unless we create that alternative ourselves, like through space travel or something. So I need to take care of it for my own sake and for humanity's sake because they're essential to my survival and to my well-being. The future of this planet is very much a fragile thing, and I can look at it that way, whereas you can kind of say, yeah, oh well, God's going to make another one. It's actually your viewpoint that adds to a lot of damage to this world, not the other way around.
I think there's a ton of common ground here between Christians and between atheists. What's embedded in this list, though, are certain ideas that are not as at home in an atheist worldview as they are a Christian worldview. There has to be a higher source. It talks about goodness, meaning, and responsibility. There's oughts and commandments and all sorts of things in here that to me make a lot more sense if there's a God who's designed us to live a certain way. Because commandments kind of seem to point towards a command.
I don't think this lists are commands, as this is what you've gotten wrong all the way through this video. But just because you can't see the ought and meaning and command without God does not mean that those things aren't valid. That's your incredulity talking. I can do what I ought to because it benefits myself and others. I can find meaning in life without the need for that meaning to be eternal. I can live a good life, that being subjective to me, without a God. They're not commands, once again, so there is no commander.
Now I'm curious, what do you think?
Well, as I look at these 10, I would love to talk to different atheists about this because Christians unanimously agree upon the 10 commandments. I would have a hard time believing that every single atheist would agree with all 10 of these. But personally, my favorite one is number 9. There's no one right way to live, yet it's telling you the right way to live. So I think that's a super interesting list, but this is awesome.
Great feedback, thanks.
Scotty, you're truly becoming the son of your father and your grandfather. Christians may agree on what the commandments are if they've decided on what list to follow. Once again, Exodus or Deuteronomy. The interpretations of these commandments are subject to the Christian. There's nothing objective in the Bible's 10 commandments as far as morality because they are firstly subject to the God that gave them and then subject to the interpreter of the commandment. So that makes it even worse. The fact is there is really no agreement on how the 10 commandments should be applied, and they get applied in many different ways. Also, this whole list that you've been responding to is once again non-commandments. So they are not telling you how to live in the first place to say, oh, but they're telling us this, but then they're telling us how to live. It seems kind of, weird. Commands require a commander, but they're not commandments. You and your father just didn't bother to do your homework to find out where this list came from. And it doesn't speak well for Biola's teaching as far as their research methods.
Hey, hope you enjoyed this, whether you're a Christian or an atheist. Tell us what you think. If you're an atheist and you think, Kai, there's other commandments that should have been in here. If you think I didn't understand or botched one of the commandments, give us your feedback. Would love to hear. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, you botched the whole thing, not understanding these were not commandments. So that's kind of my final evaluation is you kind of fumbled the ball here all the way through. And because of this constant fumbling, I think you lost the game. Well, that's it for my reaction to this. My whole thought was to give my own thoughts to this list of non-commandments that the McDowell twins here, Sean and Scotty, are reacting to. And it's kind of sad when apologists are going to do this, but In general, I don't think atheists make commandments. I don't think that this is something that we do. What we do is a constant evaluation of how we're living our life, the way we're living our lives, the things that we're doing. And so I look at this list and I say, yeah, there's a lot of nice principles, but there is a lot of things to flesh out. Because unlike commandments, non-commandments, principles, guidelines are something you have to think about, evaluate, constantly evolve, can be changed. That's unlike the real 10 Commandments, which can't be changed. And so the morality of them is stuck in the Iron Age in which they were given. Whereas any kind of suggestion or guidelines, whether it's 10 or more or less, we can evaluate. We can do things, different things with. We can say, well, you know what, the more we learn, the more we can get rid of this idea. And I think that's the real issue here because, unfortunately for Sean and Scotty, they don't seem to get past the idea that human flourishing and human life is valuable enough in and of itself to create moral systems, to have goals, things like that. They've got to add on their mythology to it, and that's the real problem. And by adding on the mythology, they actually create even more problems because they get their morality stuck, they get their goals and objectives stuck, and they don't have really the ability truly to be open-minded as much as they say they do. Sean thinks there's a lot of common ground here, but I disagree with him because Scotty says, I'd like to sit down with some of these atheists. The first things the atheist is going to tell you, Scotty, is these aren't commandments. These are more like guidelines and actual rules. And while they're great thought provokers, they're not something I'm commanded to do as an atheist. And that should have been your first suspicion in the first place. So my final evaluation of the video is, man, I really wish they'd got it right. And like Paulogia and Skeptics and Scoundrels, there's another list, I believe, at the end of the book, a book I now definitely want to read, of actual 10 commandments, another list that I think an apologist would have a much harder time dealing with and finding common ground on. And I would really like to see Sean do that one instead of this one. But I think, like many others, he did this one because it was a popular thing to do to rah-rah his supporters. But like myself, I'm going to kind of point out that he's got some problems, and that's kind of where it is. Appreciate all the likes, shares, and subscribes. You guys are awesome. I want to give a shout out to all my members, to my Rabyd citizens, to my citizens. Thank you very much. You're the people that make this channel really worth doing. Thank you very much. Your support is greatly appreciated. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So make sure that you're giving all your time, your money, your opportunities to building up yourself, making your life better, and making it better for the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do so. And don't waste all that stuff on the trappings of religion and faith. It's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.